does it take for a team to go from being the joke of the NFL to holding the Lombardi Trophy as Super Bowl champions? Can a single victory change the fate of an entire city?
Freeney, the most watched ankle in the entire week.
The story of the New Orleans Saints is one of the most incredible underdog tales in sports history. For decades, this team was stuck at the bottom, but they never gave up. How did they transform from the Aints to champions, inspiring an entire city in the process? This isn't just a football story, it's a journey filled with struggle, heart, and redemption. Let's dig into how the Saints rose to the top and gave the city of New Orleans something to believe in when it needed hope the most. The story of the New Orleans Saints begins in 1967, but their real impact would take decades to materialize. The Saints were brought into the NFL as an expansion team, symbolizing hope for a city that had always embraced sports with passion. However, success wasn't easy to come by. From the moment they stepped onto the field, it was clear that this was not going to be a quick journey to the top. In their first season, the Saints managed just 3 wins, an unfortunate foreshadowing of what would come in the years ahead. Their early seasons were plagued with difficulties, constant coaching changes, bad drafts, and a lack of star power to elevate the team.
They played lately. Billy Joe Hobart, well, maybe not give him this nod. This was...
By the time the 1970s rolled around, the team was already a punchline to many jokes across the NFL. They didn't even manage a winning season until 1987, 2 decades after their inception. Can you imagine being a fan through all of that? Despite the losses, the fans in New Orleans stood by their team. Maybe it's because the city itself has always been a place where resilience runs deep. Through hurricanes, floods, and poverty, the people of New Orleans have always known how to bounce back. And that's what the Saints were trying to do too, year after year. For the longest time though, it seemed like the only thing the Saints were good at was disappointing their loyal followers, but that loyalty never wavered. There's a certain charm to being an underdog, and New Orleans understood that better than anyone. Even when the team was mocked and called the Aints, and when fans wore bags over their heads in protest, they kept showing up. They kept hoping. That unwavering support is what laid the foundation for everything that came later. It wasn't just about football, it was about representing a city that knew struggle and understood the importance of sticking together, no matter how tough things got. The 1970s and 1980s were a brutal time to be a Saints fan. If the team had been struggling in its first few years, things didn't get much better over the next 2 decades. The Saints were trapped in a cycle of poor management, questionable decisions, and bad luck. Coach after coach came and went, and yet, no one could figure out how to turn the team's fortunes around.
Was it in the playbook, Tom? Jerome Woods makes the pick, his 4th pick of the year. 31 interceptions.
During these years, the Saints were so consistently bad that even mediocrity would have felt like a win, but that didn't happen. Instead, the Saints consistently finished at the bottom of the standings. They didn't just lose games, they lost in spectacular fashion, often being blown out by teams that barely broke a sweat. In fact, they became so synonymous with losing that the infamous Aints nickname was born, with fans bringing bags to cover their faces in public. Even during these dismal seasons, there was one name that shone through the darkness: Archie Manning. The father of future NFL stars Payton and Eli Manning, Archie was the one glimmer of hope the Saints had during the 1970s. He was a talented quarterback, a gifted athlete who could have thrived on a better team. But for all his abilities, Manning never had much help. His time in New Orleans was spent running for his life behind a porous offensive line and watching his team flounder in the standings. Still, Manning's presence gave fans something to cheer for, even when the losses piled up. His grit and determination in the face of adversity mirrored the city itself. He was a star in a dimly lit room, and despite the Saints' troubles, Archie Manning remains one of the most beloved figures in the team's history. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Saints fans were used to the disappointment. They had long accepted their role as the NFL's perennial losers, but something was brewing under the surface. The Saints had hired a new general manager, Jim Finks, and head coach Jim Mora, both of whom would set the team on a path toward improvement. Under their leadership, the team saw its first glimmer of hope in 1987, reaching the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. The Saints may not have won a Super Bowl just yet, but the wheels were finally turning in the right direction. In 2006, the entire trajectory of the New Orleans Saints shifted in a way that no one could have predicted. That was the year when 2 men arrived in the Crescent City who would change the course of Saints history forever. head coach Sean Payton, and quarterback Drew Brees. Up until then, the Saints were still struggling to find their identity. But the arrival of Payton and Brees didn't just change the team, it changed everything. Drew Brees was a gamble. After suffering a devastating shoulder injury while playing for the San Diego Chargers, many teams were unsure whether he could ever return to his previous form. The Miami Dolphins famously passed on signing him, and the Saints swooped in to take the risk. Brees came to New Orleans with a lot to prove, but he wasn't just there to resurrect his career. He was there to help a city rebuild. Payton, on the other hand, was an unproven head coach with a fiery attitude and a vision for what the Saints could be. He brought an aggressive, innovative offensive scheme that was tailor-made for Brees' style of play. The two of them clicked immediately, and together they set out to build something that New Orleans had never seen before, a winning football team. Their first season together was nothing short of miraculous.
The back, the pitch, Williams.
In 2006, just 1 year after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, the Saints went 10-6 and reached the NFC Championship game for the first time in franchise history. For a city still reeling from the destruction, the Saints' success was a much-needed source of pride and hope. The Superdome, once a symbol of chaos and despair during Katrina, became a fortress of joy and defiance. The Payton-Brees partnership was special. Under Payton's leadership, the Saints' offense became one of the most explosive in the league. Brees, who many had written off after his injury, blossomed into one of the best quarterbacks of his generation.
201 yards is the magic number that Drew Brees has to reach in order to set the NFL's...
His accuracy, leadership, and determination were the perfect complement to Payton's aggressive play calling. Together, they didn't just win games, they transformed the Saints into a perennial contender. By 2009, the Saints were ready to take the next step. After years of heartache and failure, they were on the brink of greatness. The city of New Orleans, which had suffered so much in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, was about to get the redemption story it so desperately deserved. But no one could have predicted just how incredible that journey would be. The story of the New Orleans Saints would not be complete without addressing one of the most catastrophic events in the city's history, Hurricane Katrina. In 2005, the storm devastated New Orleans, flooding neighborhoods, displacing thousands, and causing unimaginable destruction. It was one of the deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history, and its aftermath left the city in ruins, with many wondering if it would ever truly recover. The Saints, like the rest of the city, were deeply affected by the hurricane. The Superdome, their home stadium, became a makeshift shelter for thousands of residents who had nowhere else to go. The images of the Superdome, once a proud symbol of New Orleans' love for football, now filled with desperate people seeking refuge, were broadcast across the world. The Saints were forced to play their 2005 season on the road, with no home field and no real sense of when or if they would return to New Orleans. The city was in chaos. People had lost their homes, their livelihoods, and, in many cases, loved ones. Rebuilding the city seemed like an impossible task, and in many ways, the Saints' future in New Orleans was uncertain. There was even talk of relocating the team permanently. But in the face of all this adversity, something incredible happened. The people of New Orleans rallied behind their team, and the team in turn became a symbol of hope and resilience for the city. When the Saints finally returned to the Superdome in 2006, the significance of that moment was not lost on anyone. It wasn't just about football anymore. It was about proving that New Orleans could come back stronger. Their Monday Night Football game against the Atlanta Falcons on September 25, 2006, was the first game played in the Superdome since Katrina. The atmosphere was electric. The Saints won that game in a blowout, 23-3, and the city celebrated like it was a Super Bowl victory. It was more than just a win. It was a symbol of the city's rebirth. The team and the city were now intertwined in a way that went beyond the usual relationship between a sports franchise and its fans. The Saints were playing for something bigger than themselves. They were playing for New Orleans, for its people, and for the hope that, despite the devastation of Katrina, the city would rise again. This bond between the team and the community became the foundation of everything that followed. By the time the 2009 season rolled around, the Saints were ready. They had been building something special for a few years under Payton and Brees, and in 2009, it all came together.
It's hard for me to reflect too much right now just because my career's not done.
The Saints stormed through the regular season, finishing with a 13-3 record, the best in the NFC. The offense was electric. Brees was unstoppable, setting records left and right. But it wasn't just Brees.
In a bottle. Now, Drew was by far had his most successful years of his NFL career.
The team was stacked with talent. Reggie Bush, Marquise Colston, Jeremy Shockey, and on defense, guys like Jonathan Vilma and Darren Sharper were making big plays. The Saints weren't just winning, they were dominating. But this wasn't just about winning games. The Saints had the weight of an entire city on their shoulders. Every win felt like a win for New Orleans. The city was still recovering from Katrina, and the Saints were a huge part of that healing process. They were playing with a purpose, and that purpose was bigger than football. The 2009 playoffs were unforgettable. First up, the Arizona Cardinals. The Saints demolished them 45-14 in the divisional round. It was clear this team wasn't messing around. Then came the NFC Championship game against the Minnesota Vikings, led by Brett Favre. This game was a nail-biter. Back and forth, big plays on both sides, and it went into overtime. In overtime, the Saints forced a turnover and drove down the field. Kicker Garrett Hartley nailed a 40-yard field goal, sending the Saints to their first ever Super Bowl. The Superdome erupted, and the entire city of New Orleans went wild. This was more than just a football game. This was history in the making. Super Bowl 44, Saints versus the Colts, led by the legendary Payton Manning. The Colts were heavy favorites, but the Saints didn't care.
He would go. Drew Brees and Payton Manning, the first ever matchup.
They were ready to shock the world. The game didn't start well for the Saints. They fell behind 10-0 early, and it looked like the Colts were going to run away with it. But the Saints kept fighting. They clawed their way back, and in one of the gutsiest moves in Super Bowl history, Sean Payton called for an onside kick to start the second half. The Saints recovered the ball, and the momentum shifted. Drew Brees was on fire.
He's got 3 Pro Bowl offensive linemen to the right side. Go for it!
Picking apart the Colts defense with short, precise passes. The game was tight, but in the fourth quarter, the defining moment came. Saints cornerback Tracy Porter intercepted a pass from Manning and took it 74 yards for a touchdown, sealing the victory. The Saints won 31-17, their first Super Bowl title in franchise history. This wasn't just a Super Bowl win, this was a victory for the entire city of New Orleans. The Saints' win in Super Bowl 44 gave the city something to celebrate after years of hardship and rebuilding.
Realizing the dream of so many New Orleanians and so many...
The streets were packed with fans chanting, "Who dat?" and celebrating like never before. It was more than just a football game. It was a symbol of the city's resilience. After Katrina, many thought New Orleans would never recover, but the Saints showed that with heart, determination, and a whole lot of grit, anything is possible. This win wasn't just for the team, it was for everyone who had stuck with the Saints through the hard times, and for everyone who had stuck with New Orleans through the hardest of times. So what's the Saints' legacy? Well, that 2009 season will go down in history as one of the greatest underdog stories in sports. But the story doesn't end there. The Saints continued to be a competitive team under Payton and Brees for years. They made the playoffs multiple times, but another Super Bowl title eluded them. Drew Brees eventually retired in 2020, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. The team has gone through some transitions, but the bond between the Saints and the city of New Orleans remains as strong as ever. They're more than just a football team. They're a symbol of hope, resilience, and the spirit of New Orleans. The New Orleans Saints' journey from being the Aints to Super Bowl champions is one of the most incredible stories in NFL history. It's a tale of perseverance, belief, and an unbreakable bond with the people of New Orleans. They didn't just win a football game, they uplifted an entire city. If you enjoyed this video and want more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and share. And of course, hit that subscribe button and press the bell icon to stay updated with our latest content. Together, let's keep the spirit of champions alive.